Well, welcome everybody to the weekly Sunday afternoon tour of the Old Cemetery Society. My name is Yvonne and I am your tour guide today. I only wish that you could all be here in the cemetery with me, but I know that's going to happen very soon and we're all looking forward to that. Well, today is a tour that we haven't done for many, many years, and it's really fortuitous that this is the Memorial Day weekend in the United States, and that's why we chose this subject for this Sunday. The Memorial Day weekend is observed in the US on the last Monday of May every year, and it honors the men and women who have died in the armed forces of the US. It was originally called Decoration Day, and it started just after the Civil War, which took place from 1861 to 1865. It wasn't, however, made an official federal holiday over 100 years later in 1971. Typically, the way it's commemorated is that people visit cemeteries and memorials. There are parades, there are family gatherings, and it is considered the unofficial start to summer. Just like for us, it's May 23rd, the long weekend, or 24th, the long weekend. So we started our summer a little earlier. The Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, and it claimed more lives than almost all the other conflicts that the US has been engaged in history. It also marked the beginning of the establishment of national cemeteries in the United States. Of course, Arlington is probably the one that we know best, but there are over 170 national cemeteries in the US. By the late 1860s, so the Civil War ended in 1865, by the late 1860s, the people had started having a springtime tribute in cemeteries to veterans, where they would decorate graves with flowers and put out and get together to recite prayers around the graves. And then gradually, Decoration Day, as it was called then, turned into Memorial Day, as it's known now. But initially only honored those who were killed in the Civil War. It was really World War I, where there was another large contingent of American soldiers who were killed and who served, that it became more of a national commemoration across the country. But today, of course, we're going to look back more towards the original, the origin of Memorial Day, and we're going to talk about the Civil War. We're going to talk about veterans of the Civil War who eventually ended up here in Victoria and are buried here in Ross Bay, and some other aspects of the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War is still something that really is present in the United States in many ways. I mean, look at things like the controversy about Confederate flags, about removing the statues of Confederate generals, and all that kind of thing, and all the race relations, in fact, all related to slavery and the Civil War and that. I became interested in the Civil War many years ago because of something I had read, and I wanted to look for a book to really sort of briefly understand the Civil War and what had happened. And I found a book in our library here called The War That Never Ended. And I just, from looking at, like I say, at what happens in the United States, and that it really seems that that's so true about that war, that it still is something very alive, especially in the southern US. Now, as I said, the Civil War began in 1861, and it really was the culmination of decades of simmering tensions between the North and the South, between abolitionists and the supporters of slavery. The tensions revolved around states' rights, which actually had to do with slavery, and the expansion westward into the new territories, and to whether or not those territories would allow slavery. So again, it was states' rights, but it still was all around slavery. The reason for that sort of conflict was that in the North, it had developed industrially. So it was very well industrial developed, and railroads and manufacturing and all of that. Agriculture was very small in the North. Farms tended to be small. The South was an agricultural economy. It relied on huge plantations, and the only way those plantations were economic, because they required vast amounts of labor, was through slavery. So when Southerners saw that there was this push for abolition, they felt their whole way of life and their economy was threatened. It was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 on a platform of keeping slavery out of the Western territories that caused first 7 southern states to secede, followed by 4 more soon after. And then the actual, the first battle that triggered the war, because it wasn't assumed, they didn't assume that they were actually going to go to war right away, was when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, and against the federal garrison was there, and Lincoln called out the militia to fight the insurrection. So on paper, it looked like the North had all the advantages, 22 million people versus 9 million people in the South, all the manufacturing, all the supplies and everything, but the South was fighting for its way of life. They knew their own territory, they were fighting defensively, and they had excellent ports. So it turned into what people thought would be a short war, it turned into a long war. It dragged on for 4 long years. There were over 2 million Union soldiers fought, over 1 million Confederate soldiers, and approximately 620,000 died in combat of disease. Disease was a big factor in the Civil War, accident and starvation. And just before we go, I hope that we can I'm just going to show a map that shows you in red are the Confederate states. The gray ones just above were called the border states. And then, of course, all the rest, the blue in between are the territories, and not much happened in those territories. But on the far west, of course, you have California. And we're going to be talking about California because that had an effect on Victoria, of course. But it also, you know, was a participant in all of this because of its population. So that just gives you a sense of the relative sizes, although, as I say, most of the battles, the big battles, of course, were all in the east. Okay, our first stop is just going to be over here, and I'm going to give this to my husband, John. And I am going this way. We're just going over here, not far. And this first person I'm going to talk about, in fact, came here before the Civil War. Now, this is the grave of Rebecca Gibbs, and she was one of the African-American settlers who came up to Victoria in 1858. Now, of course, 1858 was the time of the Fraser River Gold Rush, but that's not why they came. They came up here, the African-American settlers, there were approximately 800 of them, because they were trying to get away from the conditions in California that were becoming increasingly unpleasant in the lead up to the Civil War. California had experienced a huge influx of people coming both from the North and South, and in fact from all over the world, with their the gold rush in 1849. So there was a large number of Northerners who came, who were what they called free soilers, that is, people who did not support, who were abolitionists against slavery. But a lot of Southerners came, and in fact, even slave owners brought their slaves with them to work the gold fields in California. So then also there were free African Americans who had come hoping to make their fortune. So you have this whole stew of people in California that built up huge conflicts. And in fact, California itself had a north-south divide where the people in the southern part of California were more pro-slavery than the ones in the north. But in fact, the whole state was full of people who were activists on both sides. And in fact, this even spilled over into the legislature. And there was actually an act passed to split the state between the North and the South, but that was never passed by the federal government, never allowed that to go through. Now, Rebecca Gibbs herself was one of those who came up in 1858 with the others. Some of them settled in here in Victoria. Some went up to the Cariboo for the gold rush, which of course Rebecca Gibbs did. She was up there by 1862, and she actually took out a gold prospecting license, but she mostly worked as a nurse and laundress. She was up there for many years, eventually came down to Victoria, had a boarding house here, and worked as a nurse, and she died in 1873. Some of the other African Americans who came up here went back to the United States after the Civil War, expecting that things, of course, would be much better given the Emancipation Act and everything that had changed following that. And now we're just going to walk down a bit this way to this. Everything looks so nice and tidy right now. The city workers have really been busy here, and everything is really nicely cleaned up. So we'll just go over here to this quite impressive monument with these pillars. Although clearly one of the pillars has been replaced. You can see three of the pillars are very nice and fancy, and one of them isn't quite as nice as the others. This is the grave of William Heathhorn, who died in 1890. Clearly, from the scale and elaborateness of this monument, he was quite well off. He had come here and started out with just a small boot and shoe factory, but he eventually built up much more to have a factory, a whole factory. He had started out with a store. Ended up with a factory and a tannery. But the person of interest for us today is the fellow who was his manager at his factory, who had the interesting name of Essick or Esick Corson. He was in 1887, Mr. Corson, who was the manager of Heathhorn's boot and shoe factory, gave himself a big 50th birthday party at the Grand Pacific Hotel. And the Colonist wrote a big long article about this, describing his quote, eventful life. He was born in Maine. He came to San Francisco in 1847, so he came before the gold rush to San Francisco. And then apparently he returned east at the beginning of the Civil War. So he was, in one of the northern states before he came out west. And he claimed that he had served in 3 different units during the Civil War: the 6th and 8th Massachusetts Infantries and the 2nd New Jersey Infantry. Now, serving in multiple units was not unusual during the Civil War because most men only enlisted for short periods. Usually 90 days to 120 days were the typical enlistment periods. So it's not surprising that he could have belonged to more than one regiment. Now, I can see why he wanted to associate himself with the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, which was one of the ones that he claimed he belonged to, because it was the first Union regiment that claimed battle casualties in the Civil War. President Lincoln had called on all the militias, to come to Washington and defend Washington, and so they were marching from Boston to Washington, and in Baltimore they ran into huge crowds of anti-war Democrats and Southerners and Confederate supporters, and so there was a huge riot, and that's where some of the 6th Massachusetts were killed and injured. It turns out, though, that according to military and pension records, that Mr. Corson never served in the 6th Massachusetts. He served in the 8th Massachusetts, which never had any battle casualties, which served mostly on guard and garrison duties. His second enlistment after a break was the 2nd New Jersey Infantry. Now, this unit did see a lot of action during the war, but he only joined it in April 1865. Well, the war ended in April 1865. He did see a bit of action. That unit was involved in the pursuit of General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate forces, and they were present at the Appomattox Courthouse for the signing of the surrender of Lee to Ulysses S. Grant. However, looking at his records, he had a total service of 7 months, with a break from November 1864 to April 1865, and never got to be more than a private. Nonetheless, he served. He had a pension from the Civil War. So he was here, as I say, after that war, he went back to Oregon, came back west. He didn't go all the way to San Francisco. He went to Oregon, and he got into boot and shoe manufacturing there. And it was when he retired from that Mr. Heathhorn apparently invited him to come up here and work managing his boot and shoe factory. At his birthday party in 1887, Mr. Corson noted that he'd been here for 2.5 years. I'm not sure how much longer he stayed here. At the same time, he claimed that he had 16 patents for various things. Now, After reading about his Civil War service, I wonder about the 16 patents, but maybe, who knows. And it also mentioned, the article also mentioned that his wife, quote, was known all over the coast as a temperance worker and lecturer and had contributed greatly to his success. Now, colonists did tend to cover women's issues and women's events quite a bit, but I couldn't find any reference to Mrs. Corson. In researching the family history, I discovered she went back east to Maine, which is where she died. Corson went back to the U.S. In 1890. By 1890, he was back there because there's a record that he got remarried in 1890. And he lived the rest of his life as a rancher in California. And he died in 1912 at the age of 76. So now we're just going over here. So here we are at the grave of the Imbert family. You see this very large grave here. And the person I'm going to talk about is Charles Imbert, who, unlike Essex Corson, who I talked about last, was involved in the thick of things from 1862 through to the end of the war in 1865. Mr. Imbert was born in England in 1834, came to the US in 1860. When war broke out in 1861, he was in Kansas, and he joined the 13th Infantry Regiment of Union forces that were mustered in September 1862. The war started in April 1861, but really not much happened in the first part of the war. The heavy duty fighting was 1862, really through to the end of the war in early 1865. However, so he joined in 1862, and his unit saw action almost immediately at the Battle of Newtonia. This was fought in September, and it was between Confederate and Union soldiers near Newtonia, Missouri. The Confederate column was mostly cavalry, and interestingly included a brigade of Native Americans. And I noticed this comes up several times in some of the readings that I was doing, that there were Native American brigades that fought seemingly more with the Confederate side than the Union side. But I can't be sure about that. People who are more expert than I am, and I am no expert on the Civil War, would know more about that. So at the Battle of Newtonia, the Union force attacked the Confederate position, but were driven out by the Confederates. Both sides brought up reinforcements. There was seesaw fighting most of the afternoon, because these were short battles. They didn't take months, these battles. Shortly before nightfall, the Confederates made an all-out attack on the Union line, and the Union withdrew. The Confederates followed up with artillery fire, which scared the life out of the Union soldiers, who, instead of retreating in an orderly way, ran in a complete rout. Some of them apparently ran 10 miles back behind lines. So consider it a Confederate victory. Union casualties were 245, Confederate casualties 78. That was, just really one-day fighting. A couple of months later, Mr. Imbert's unit was involved in two quite big battles in relatively quick succession. One was the Battle of Cain Hill, which was fought in November 1862, when Union forces entered northwest Arkansas, and Confederate forces intercepted them because they had to protect their supply trains. Supplies did become an issue for the Confederate forces eventually through the war, so they were very careful about that. But that one set the scene for a much more major encounter, the Battle of Prairie Grove in December. So Cain Hill was November, this was December. And this was the Confederates were trying to destroy two Union divisions. There was attacks, counterattacks, cavalry, infantry, and an artillery duel that lasted the entire day. But by nightfall, neither one had won. They were at a standoff. But the Confederates had no reinforcements, so they had to retreat. And this gave the Union Army the control of Arkansas, northwest Arkansas, which was a big plus for the Union Army. The casualties on this one, 1,317 Confederate casualties, 1,251 Union casualties, and that's a one-day battle. So, that gives you a sense of how bloody these battles were. Mr. Imbert's unit after that really wasn't involved in any other major battles. They were involved in what were called skirmishes, small little encounters, smaller battles, guard duty, military policing in various places for the rest of the war. And all the units that I read about when I was researching all these fellas, they moved around a lot. You know, they were going from one fort to another, guarding prisoners of war, doing this, that, and the other thing. So they were constantly being moved around. Mr. Imbert was wounded severely twice, once in the knee and once in the face. After the war, he went back home to Kansas and then eventually to Oregon and finally to Victoria. He worked here as a carpenter and collected his Civil War pension. It's wonderful, amazing, the amount of information that's online now. Ancestry, free through the library. Can't beat it, I have to say. Mr. Imbert died at age 68 in 1902 when he fell from the platform of a moving streetcar on Fort Street. So he made it through all the Civil War battles and fell off the streetcar. He was survived by 7 children. His wife Annie had died in 1889 at age 47. And so they are buried here together. Now we have a little bit of a walk. So I'm thinking that perhaps Liz would like to mute us for this section while we walk, and then we will resume our talking when we get up there. So away we go. Now, okay. So this impressive monument is the grave of Alan Francis, and it says here USC, which means he was the United States consul here in Victoria. And in fact, he was the first US consul in Western Canada, and he was appointed here to Victoria in 1861. And you have to remember the reason that the first US consul in Western Canada was appointed to Victoria is because Vancouver did not exist. Victoria was the main center out west here. And so that's why he was appointed. He was from Illinois, and he was a personal friend of President Lincoln, who served Illinois as politically. Now, according to the US government website about the history of consulates, this consulate was established here because of the large number of Americans that came up for the gold rushes. And of course, for those of us, I'm sure all of you who are listening to this have heard all our stories about gold rushes and that, the tens of thousands of people who came through Victoria for the gold rushes and stayed here, and a good portion of those were Americans. So the US government saw a need for a consul here, but the other reason that it said on the US government website was, quote, there were also rumors that a group of Confederate sympathizers were active in the area, unquote. Well, it was more than rumors. There were tons of Confederate sympathizers here in Victoria at the time. There was even a saloon called the Confederate Saloon that flew a Confederate flag that was made by local Southern ladies who were here in Victoria. Now, Consul Francis here, Ellen Francis, according to D.W. Higgins, who wrote about this particular incident that I'm going to talk about, he cultivated a reputation as a, quote, easygoing nobody, the better to be able to infiltrate the Southern community here. And I mean, it was so American here. There were so many Americans here that really the 4th of July was celebrated with as much enthusiasm as the Queen's birthday. There just, you know, there were just lots of celebrations for that. The Civil War was covered in great detail in the local papers, and in fact, sometimes special editions were put out to cover the particularly important battles. Minor battles were fought on the streets of Victoria between North and South sympathizers, sometimes in the vicinity of the Confederate Saloon. It was on Langley Street near Yates. And Francis had his eye on a particular group of what he called, quote, desperate men from the rebel states, unquote, in his dispatches to Washington, D.C. That's how he described them. Now, in the saloon itself, the Southerners met regularly to celebrate victories, Confederate victories, and to sing patriotic songs like Way Down in Dixie and My Maryland. And some of them got together and started conspiring with a very daring plan. They wanted to outfit a privateer to prey on U.S. shipping. Now, a privateer was like a state-sponsored pirate. Privateers were privately owned ships that were given letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, from a government with permission to raid the ships of their opposing. What this did is it enabled the government not to use its own navy to harass the enemy shipping, but to use a private, and then the privateers got to keep all or some of the goods that they got from the ships that they raided. Now, the ship that they had in mind here was a really valuable one that they wanted to raid. But their plan was to get a ship here in Victoria that they would take, and that they would attack the treasure ship, as it was called, that carried gold from San Francisco, because California was still a major gold mining center, to carry gold from San Francisco that was being taken to the Union government in the East and was financing the war. Of course, the Confederates needed money too, and if they could get the money off these ships, that would be phenomenal. And it carried $2 to $3 million worth of gold twice a month. So they assumed they could function, these conspirators, without British interference, because Britain supposedly was neutral on the war, because the Confederate ships on the eastern seaboard operated that way. And they had the necessary papers, the letters of marque from the Confederate government, that made it legal for them to become privateers. They just needed a ship. So, but this was secret, right? They had to keep this secret. And, but Francis, clever man that he was able to recruit a couple of spies to infiltrate the group. One was a woman named Miss Jackson, she called herself, and claimed that she was the niece of Stonewall Jackson, who was one of the Confederate generals. And another was a man who portrayed himself as one of the most rabid of the rebel supporters. Between the two of them, they stole the letters of marque. That meant that the conspirators no longer had the legal right to be privateers. And by this time, they still hadn't managed to get a ship. There was a ship, the armed steamer Shubrick, that arrived in Victoria about this time that this was going on. And all but 2 of the officers were discharged from that ship as being suspected of being Confederate sympathizers. So the episode ended with Francis having broken up what he called, quote, the rebel camp, unquote. He was here for quite a few years as the American consul. He eventually became the consul in St. Thomas, Ontario. And it was in St. Thomas, Ontario that he died. But he and his family liked Victoria so much that his wife and one of their sons had remained living in Victoria. And so when he died in 1887, his body was brought back here and he was buried here. The son who was still living here, had died that spring, and he was buried here as well. So now we're going to head straight down that way, and it isn't far, so we don't have to be for this one. We'll just walk down this way. that is. We are very lucky that we do have a marker at the stop. Pardon? Okay. So I will try to position myself. Okay, I'm wondering which way the wind is here. I think it's that way. So maybe if I stand this way and if you go over there, Paul. Okay, this is the Northcott family marker, and it's really a lovely gray granite marker. Nice little square pillar in good shape. Now, unlike most, several of the men that were meeting today, Joseph Roger Northcott was in the regular U.S. Army, so he wasn't one of the ones that was just there for a few months at a time. He was born in Bristol, England in 1844 and came to what is now Southern Ontario with his family members in the late 1850s. Now, I don't know if he actually moved to the United States before he joined the Union Army, or whether he just went across the border in order to join up. There were quite a few British North Americans who joined up. Some of them were actually press ganged. The Americans were, later in the war, were so desperate for soldiers that some in local areas that were close to the border were actually gotten drunk and dragged back across the border, but a lot of them volunteered. Towards the end of the war, there were actual bonuses for joining. So some of them joined just to get the extra money for joining up. And there was also a thing when conscription came in, and conscription was used by both the Union and the Confederates later in the war, where either you could pay $300 to get out of serving, or you could get a substitute to serve for you, pay that person to serve for you. And so some Canadians or British North Americans at that time served that way as well. But Joseph Northcott himself joined up in Auburn, New York in the summer of 1863 when he was 19 years old. He joined the 9th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment and signed on for 3 years. So he was in for the long haul. He joined in August 1863, and at that time the regiment was just involved in building one of the forts defending Washington, D.C. But soon after, it became part of the Army of the Potomac, which was the principal Union army in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. And after that, it was pretty much battle after battle after battle for his unit. They were part of the Overland Campaign. They were part of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. They were part of the Siege of Petersburg. And finally, the Appomattox Campaign, which culminated in the surrender of General Lee to General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. And Joseph Roger Northcott was there throughout the whole thing. The war ended on April 9th, officially 1865, although there was a few little things going on after that. But there was a terrific thing called the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd to 24th, 1865, which was all the Union parts of the Union Army that came together and marched at Washington, D.C. Around that time, just after that time, Joseph transferred to the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery Regiment because, as I say, he was still in the Union Army. But then there's a notation on these information online after that that says deserter. Now, he had signed on for 3 years, so he had a whole other year to go still. So he didn't stay in and he deserted. On the other hand, there is also from later, some years later, after another decade or late, couple of decades later, of his Civil War pension. Well, if he was a deserter, I'm not sure he would have been entitled to a Civil War pension. So I'm not sure what the story is exactly there, but he did get his Civil War pension. In any case, he returned to Ontario there, and then came out west. 1890-91, he was living here in Victoria, working as a carpenter. He lived in James Bay with his brother William and a couple of sisters. His brother William is listed as a contractor in 1890, but in 1891, his brother William had become the city assessor and superintendent of public works. So he was right up there. Joseph, our man, returned to Ontario, but his two brothers, John and William, stayed here. And Joseph remained in Ontario until he died in 1912 at the age of 68. And this is the grave of his brother John. Brother William is buried up in the far corner of the cemetery up there. but obviously Joseph was well enough known here that the colonists bothered to put a little piece about him in the paper, and they referred to him as, quote, an old-time resident of BC, having come here in 1885. So that's him. Now we're going over there, and I'm going to ask Liz to mute for a bit because I need a drink of water. So that's what's going to happen now. Okay. Well, when George Giles died in 1910 at the age of 74, his colonist obituary noted that he had been in Victoria for about 25 years, but he spent all his summers at Shawnigan Lake. He was known as one of the oldest and best known hunters, fly fishermen, and woodsmen of the district, but he worked as what was called a carriage trimmer. What that was he fitted out the interiors of carriages as in horse-drawn carriages that people would sit in. So that was upholstery, luggage racks, luggage supports, anything like that. He was born in England, but he immigrated to the U.S. at an early age, and with his parents, and they ended up in Kentucky by 1850. He was there when the Civil War broke out, and his obituary says, quote, George was in Kentucky during the progress of the U.S. Civil War. Now, it doesn't say that he served, and I couldn't find anything specific about it, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But Kentucky was a really interesting state during the Civil War, the outset of the Civil War in particular. It was the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, although Lincoln's family moved from there when he was still quite young, and he ended up representing Illinois when he was in politics. But it was his birthplace and the birthplace of his wife, Mary Todd, and also the birthplace of the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis. So there were vested interests on both the North and South. And it was bordered on the north by firmly Union states, which were Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and on the south by Confederate Tennessee, and on the east by Confederate Virginia, which held the capital of the Confederacy at Richmond. So very much a border state. So it was threatened, depending on which side it decided to go with, it would have been threatened from either the north or the south. So what it attempted at first was to be neutral. Thought that it could get away with not doing anything. But that didn't work because the Confederacy tried to take it. So that meant that they needed assistance. They petitioned the Union government for assistance, and so they got the Union Army. And after early 1862, they were under Union control. But they were in the odd situation that they were a Union, so a northern state, but they allowed slavery. So it was an odd situation that way. And same thing, West Virginia and Missouri. Same thing. On that earlier map that I showed, some of you may have noticed there were some gray states that weren't like red or black. That was Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, the border states that, although they affiliated with the Union, they in fact allowed slavery. Now, Kentucky was the site of several fierce battles. About 35,000 Kentuckians served as Confederate soldiers, but about 125,000 served as Union soldiers. Was George Giles one of them? Seems likely that he would have been, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, both sides resorted to conscription later in the war. So it seems likely to me that a man in his mid-20s would likely have been called up in some way, unless he managed to get a substitute to serve for him, or in some other way got out of it. And also, when I was looking, sort of researching on ancestry and that, I came across an article about researching Civil War veterans, and apparently a lot of Civil War veterans served under different names. So who knows? He might have served under a different name. He eventually immigrated to Victoria in 1885 and spent the rest of his life here. He was considered, as I mentioned right at the beginning, he spent his summers at Shawnigan Lake and is considered to be the first person to have put up a shack on the shores of the lake. So he was one of the ones who started it as a holiday center. And on his last day of work in January 1910, the colonist Obituary noted, quote, he remarked to a friend, "I'll never see Shawnigan Lake again," which proved to be true, for he was taken suddenly ill and died of heart disease. And now we're just going right to this little marker right here. This is the grave of William Archibald Robertson, who died in 1926 at the ripe old age of 93. And he had quite a life, this man. According to the information I have here, in just when he was in BC, he had been a prospector, a carriage maker, a blacksmith, an alderman, a school trustee, and an MLA. But he also had an interesting time before he ever came to BC. He came to Canada from Scotland with his parents when he was only 2 years old, and they settled in southwestern Ontario in the Grand River area. I had to look that up because I'm from Ottawa, which is also in Ontario, but as far as I'm concerned, the southwest Ontario is a black hole. I don't know anything about it. It's quite far away, so I had to look it up. Well, anyway, if you're interested in where Grand River is, you can look it up. He grew up there and went into business as a young man with a neighbor, and they were blacksmiths and wagon makers. In the late 1920s, when the Civil War began, his colonist Obituary said, quote, he joined the Northern Army in a regiment of Scotsmen raised by the Federalists for patrol duties in the South. Now, between 33,000 and 55,000 men from British North America served in the Union Army, and a few hundred in the Confederate Army. Many already lived in the States, and others signed up, as I mentioned when I talked about Northcott, for various reasons. Some were press ganged. Now, the thing about the Scotsmen, though, was a bit puzzling to me. I couldn't find anything about a regiment specifically raised for Scotsmen, especially if they were recruited from British North America, from Canada. But there were Scottish-themed regiments in the Union Army. They were mostly based on pre-war militia units. Some of them actually wore kilts. They really decked themselves out, in the whole Scottish thing. About 600,000 Scots had immigrated to the United States between 1851 and 61. And of course, the Scots have a very rich military tradition. So it's not surprising that that was carried over into the army. And both the northern and southern states actually had some units that focused on that. The New York 79th was by far the most famous one. It comes up again and again if you look that thing up. And in 1861, their lieutenant colonel wrote that he was going to Canada to obtain pipers and kilts for the entire regiment. So maybe that's what they were talking about when it says, that Robertson was recruited specifically for a Scottish regiment. In any case, he did serve, and he had the rank of lieutenant. He was fought in the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, in Virginia, which was fought over 3 days, one of the longer. It was a really big battle, and in end of August 1862. It was a Confederate victory. 22,177 casualties for 3 days. Of those, more than half were Union soldiers. William Robertson himself was taken prisoner and later released and returned to the North. There seemed to have been, from the impression I get, again, I'm not an expert, this is just my reading, that there was a lot of capturing and release of prisoners. There were also huge, horrible prisoner of war camps, but there was also seemed to be a lot of capture and release of prisoners returning to their areas. And he was one one that was returned, and that was basically the end of his military career, his war service. The following year, in 1863, he headed west to Victoria. And when I read that he'd been a prospector, of course, he came in 1863. I assumed he was going up to the Caribou Gold Rush, right? Turns no, he was a coal prospector. So he was prospecting here on the island. He was prospecting around Duncan, and he actually found coal and started a coal mine of his own there. I don't know how successful it was. That didn't get a lot of coverage in his obituary and that, so I'm assuming it wasn't that successful. He was elected to the first BC legislature in 1871 and to Victoria City Council in 1886. And when he died in 1926 at the age of 93, a piper played at his graveside. Only fitting. And now we're going to be muted again because we've got a little bit of a walk over there. All right. We are at the grave of Henry Wallace. I think this is a sandstone monument, and I'm afraid that one of these days this lovely sphere is going to split. It's got a big crack coming down here. It's kind of interesting here. I just noticed in this light you can really see he was an odd fellow. He was a Mason, and he belonged to the Foresters, the Independent Order of Foresters, or I forget what the full name was, which was another fraternal organization that focused more on insurance and that. Now, Henry Waller's obituary contained a rather odd statement that made me wonder about what really happened to him in the US during the Civil War. But let's begin at his beginning. He was born in England in 1835 and received a, quote, scanty education. It's kind of an interesting description. And as a boy, began working at the Woolwich Arsenal making artillery shells. And then it says in that he, quote, continued there until age 16. So clearly he started when he was really a young boy. And that at age 16, he immigrated to Canada and worked on a farm for a short time. He then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and that's where he was when the Civil War broke out in 1861. So here's the statement that kind of struck me as odd. Quote, when the Civil War broke out, efforts were made to enroll him in the Army of the North. Being a British subject, he was not forced to take up arms. Well, according to everything I've read about the Civil War, there was initially no problem with enlistment in general. So they weren't at first press ganging just about anybody they could find into service. And there were certainly no problem with a lot of these other fellows who were British subjects that joined, but I guess he didn't want to, and that was his reason for not joining, was that he was a British subject. And I guess perhaps, and then it says that his obituary says, a short time later, he was attracted by news of the fabulous wealth of California and set out for the Western gold mines. Well, I wonder if he was just trying to get away from the possibility of having to serve in Ohio, which was one of the hotspots, which we'll talk about Ohio a little bit more towards the end. We're almost at the end. He just wanted to get out of there, so it was less likely he'd have to serve. So he, and because the thing is, the California gold rush had been 1849. It was over for a long time. I mean, they were still mining gold in California. Presumably, you could still, make something, but it wasn't. It was not a gold rush mentality at that point. But in any case, he heard of caribou, so he headed north to Victoria, and that's where he stopped. He had two sisters living here and decided that he would just settle down here. He managed a restaurant, which burned down, and then he went into the confectionery business on Fort Street for 15 years, sold out, moved to Montreal for 7 years, came back, went back into the confectionery business here, the Oddfellows block, which is interesting because he was an Oddfellow, on Douglas Street, which is still there. He was there for 9 years. Then he farmed for a little bit, and then he went up to Cumberland and operated a general store there. So he certainly moved around a lot. He liked to move. He retired to Victoria and lived with his son. He died in 1916 at the age of 80 after a very full life, I have to say. So now we just have a few more stories, but I'm going to do all of these in one spot for the last few, because the last two stories are way down there, and one of them has no marker and the other one only has a curve. So we're just going to go up here. It's just a little ways. So I'm going to suggest that we not bother with the muting this time, and we'll just make our way over there because it's just by that tree.
Thought that was a bone, but I think it's a piece of wood.
So I'm going to suggest to Paul that he might like to sit down because I'm going to be here for a while, and because John has my water.
Yeah.
So I will get started with William Washington Watson.
Just. Oh, we didn't mute.
We didn't mute.
Sorry.
And he's a bit unusual compared to a lot of the fellows we talked about today, in that he was actually born in the U.S. He was born in Ohio in 1837, but in 1850 the family moved to Illinois to farm. In the 1860 U.S. Census, he shows up as a laborer on his father's farm. Now, in May 1862, there were rumors that a great force was moving on Washington, D.C. So there was an urgent call to the governors of the states to forward immediately to Washington all the volunteers and militias in their state. Illinois organized 5 infantry regiments. So William Watson became a private in the 67th Illinois Infantry Regiment in June 1862, and he signed on for 3 months. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of them only signed up for either 90 days or 120 days. The 5 regiments were organized in order to relieve veteran forces who would then be put into battle against the Confederates. So that was the idea there, was that these inexperienced regiments would be brought in and they would do the defensive type efforts, whereas that would free up the experienced soldiers to do more fighting. Now, Watson's regiment served out its 3 months doing guard duty at Camp Douglas at Chicago, which was a huge prisoner of war camp. It was a terrible location by all accounts. It was low, it was swampy. It had originally been a training camp, but only for a very short time. And by the time William Watson was there, it was a prisoner of war camp. It had rickety wooden barracks, a very crude sewage system. It started taking in more and more prisoners, keeping them for longer and longer. And because it was not intended to provide for these large numbers, of course, it was inadequate for that. There was an 1862 U.S. Sanitary Commission report, and this is what the report said, quote, "The amount of standing water, of unpoliced grounds, of foul sinks were latrines, of general disorder, of soil reeking with miasmic accretions of rotten bones and emptying of camp pebbles, was enough to drive a sanitarian mad. So what was interesting too in reading about this camp, now, I mean, some of us may have heard of Andersonville, which was a big Confederate camp that was for Union soldiers, which was one of the worst ever prisoner of war camps in all history. This was similar. It was a similar case. But what was really bizarre about this one, I don't know if this happened in Andersonville, this was right at Chicago. It turned into a tourist attraction. People would come out. They actually built bleachers outside, platforms, so that people could come out and stand up there and look at the poor suffering Confederate prisoners. It's strange what people will do. Anyway, I expect William Watson and his regiment were very happy to leave that after their 3-month stint in October that year. That was his only service, but he still was entitled, of course, to a pension at the end of it. In 1865, he married in Illinois, and then by 1869 was living in Kansas, where he and his wife had 2 children. Then they came to Victoria 1875 and had another child, was born here. He worked as a carpenter at the Albion Iron Works for many, many years, and he died at the age of 87 in 1924. Now, the next fellow, John Shin, if you walk more or less straight down here and then over a few rows, he's more or less in the middle of that next section without a marker. So we're not going there. We're going to stay here, and I'm going to tell you about John Shin, who was one of the 100 Days Men of Ohio. Now, John Alexander Shin had only lived in Victoria for 4 years when he died at the age of 69 in 1910, and his obituary in the Victoria Daily Times claimed that he was a Civil War veteran who had served from the time war started until peace was declared. This was a sort of a standard trope in the Civil War obituaries, claiming that they had been through the whole thing. Very few of them had. But according to his record, that wasn't true. He had the distinction of being what I mentioned was one of the 100 Days Men of Ohio. And what this was that in 1864, the governors of several northern states, including Ohio, convinced the federal authorities to call up state militia forces, the National Guard units in particular, for regular military duty. What they wanted was, what they were looking for was more protection from the U.S. government, but they could only do that if they supplied some military of their own. So they believed that these free regular soldiers serving in forts or guarding other important state sites in northern states for duty with Union's invading armies in the Confederacy, the militiamen would free up the regular soldiers who were doing all of that guard duty and stuff, and they'd go and fight, and the militiamen would do the protection type work. And that this surge of men, by pushing a whole bunch of men in there, would end the war in 100 days. So they signed up, Ohio and these other states signed up all these men, all these National Guard men, and moved them out for 100 days. That was the plan. 100 days, the war would be over. Now, John Shin was in the Ohio 38th Infantry, which was made up of 3 National Guard battalions, and they were mustered in mid-May 1864. Remember, the war had started in 1861, so we're already into the 3rd year of the war. They moved around a lot. They went to Washington, D.C., West Virginia, and within those spots, they moved around. I don't know, they were like in dozens of places. Among the responsibilities they had was picket duty, which is sort of like sentry duty, only on a large scale, where you have a whole regiment that's distributed out in a distance. It's very hazardous for infantry, apparently, picket duty, because they're the first ones that encounter the enemy if an enemy attack. So they did picket duty. And they guarded Confederate prisoners. There's at White House Landing in Virginia. These were prisoners of war that had just come off the battlefield and were being moved to prisoner of war camps. And there's a really famous photograph that you can see online of these very bedraggled looking Confederate prisoners that are all sort of lying around on the ground and standing there waiting at White House Landing to be moved off. And that's where John Shin was at the time, guarding these prisoners. He and his regiment mustered out on September 1st, 1864. So their 100 days were up, September 1st, 1864. The war ended 7 months later. So much for the 100-day surge that was going to end the war. Before his service, he was a farmer in Ohio, and he had a wife and 6 children. By 1890, when the Civil War pension record that's online, he was still living in Ohio, getting his pension. He only came to Victoria about 1906 to live with one of his sisters, and he died at 69. And one more story, and this gentleman is buried close to Memorial Crescent, even farther than John Shin, like sort of halfway down. He does have a curve, and it's got his full name, Theodore Sebring, on the curve. So if you were looking for him, you could actually find him. And he was another Ohio veteran. So we have, funnily enough, we have several Ohio veterans here, but he had a very different experience from John Shin. He died here in Victoria at the age of 87 and had been here for 14 years living with his daughter, Emma Gillingham. He was born in Ohio, and he was one of the Civil War long haulers. He was in for the really long time. He was 18 when he signed on for 3 years with the 87th Ohio Infantry Regiment and re-enlisted with the rest of his regiment in 1864. The earliest fighting of this unit was just skirmishing, but they were soon in the thick of the battles and then stayed there for the rest of the war. So this is, I think you might see a pattern here when you look at all these fellas. The ones who were in for the short terms, they generally weren't in a lot of battles, whereas the ones who were the long haulers, they were the bulk of the army. They were really doing the major fighting. So here's a quote from their regiment history about the final months of the war. During the spring, summer, and fall of 1864, the regiment confronted the enemy at all times within range of their guns. And it is said, by officers competent to judge, that in that time it was under fire 200 times. Out of 600 muskets taken to the front in the spring, 3/5 were laid aside during the year on account of casualties. That is, 3/5 of the men were taken out as casualties. Casualties aren't all deaths. Some are injuries, some are sickness. It was the siege. It was in the siege of Petersburg, which one of the major battles, and witnessed the close at Appomattox. So again, really long haul. He was the second one of our veterans today who made it beyond private. Archibald Robertson had been a lieutenant, or as they would have said, a lieutenant. And Theodore Sebring ended the war as a sergeant. He served a total of 4 years and 1 month, so that was a lot of service, and was mustered out in December 1865. The war had ended in April, but a lot of soldiers, especially the regular army, were kept in until the end of December. He moved to Canada at some point to work on the construction of the CPR west of Winnipeg. So he lived in Western Canada, sort of Alberta area for a while, but he ended his days here. He had 3 daughters living here, and he was collecting his Civil War pension when he died. And that is the end of our Civil War tour today, and I hope that was interesting and informative for you. And next week we have a slight change to the schedule. Is that right, John? John is going to give a tour next week. Originally, the plan was that I think Nick Russell was going to talk, but John is going to be talking, and Nick Russell is going to be doing a talk in July. We'll be posting the July to December schedule very soon. Now that I'm finished this tour, I'll finish writing up the schedule for the rest of the year. And John, if you want to say briefly what you're going to be talking about next week.
Okay, I will. And then there are some comments and questions in the chat. So next week, we're going to be doing a tour on annexationists who lived here or were involved with Victoria. And this is, actually, I'm probably able to, I've unmuted myself, so I think I can probably talk this way. So I think there's a bit of feedback, actually. So yes, so I'm going to be talking about annexationists, and there is a tiny little bit of overlap with the stories that Yvonne was telling today, especially with Alan Francis. And but not everybody in British Columbia, especially in Victoria, were in favor of joining Canada. This year, 2021, is the 150th anniversary of British Columbia becoming part of Canada back in July 1871. And in July, we'll be having a tour on the theme of joining Canada. But next week, we're going to be talking about the ones who had other ideas, the ones who thought we should become part of the United States. So I'm going to now switch to chat because I think there were some comments, if I'm not mistaken. A comment here, one coming in from Virginia. My great grandmother passed away 145 years ago today and is buried near Emily Carr. You might remember we included that grave on our Christmas tour, and please tell her hello for me. We definitely will. We'll stop back that way on our way, and we'll definitely fondly think of your great grandmother. And hopefully one of these days you'll have a chance to get here in person to actually see the grave. Last Christmas, we put a wreath on the grave for you. So the grave is definitely still there in good condition. Thank you for letting us know that. And comment here. Thank you, Yvonne, for a most interesting tour. Lots of relevant research. We always learn something new. So if there are any questions or further comments, now is the time to do it through chat, or you can unmute yourselves and ask them that way. Otherwise, we'll close it off within a minute. And thank you, Yvonne. This was a great tour and beautiful day. It's actually nice and warm here in the cemetery.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah, it worked out very, very well. So thank you on behalf of all of us.
Okay, thanks a lot. I guess that's it for now. Eh?
It is.
Okay, thanks,
And-
everybody.
And thank you, Paul and Liz, for having done the camera work and the hosting.
Yeah, and to you, John.